By 1964, Carlo Gambino's world was nothing like it had been the year before. The shadows were gone. The quiet days of working behind curtains, ducking cameras, and pretending he didn't run half of New York were finished. He was out front now. The last of the old guard had either been buried or were on their way there. Albert Anastasia was gone. His brother, Tough Tony, had gone into the ground in '63 while the old-timers held their breath, half expecting gunmen to show up, even at the funeral. The Anastasia era was over. What remained was legend, and legends didn't run crime families. Gambino did. He was now the single most powerful man in the American underworld. But the decade wasn't going to let him keep the old picture frame. One by one, the men who helped him build the empire began dying off. Joseph Biondo, J.B., Joe the Blonde, Little Rabbit, the underboss who could jump out of any conversation he didn't want to be in, died in June of 1966 at 69. Tommy Lucchese was diagnosed with a brain tumor and stepped down. He died the next year. The syndicate was shifting under Gambino's feet, and he had to rebuild the foundation while keeping the Bonanno mess from spilling into a full war. He had the pieces, and he arranged them like a man playing 3 chessboards at once. The Castellano wing who ran white-collar muscle. Paul Castellano was the rising star. Construction, unions, poultry, trucking, anything that required contracts, accountants, or intimidation wearing a suit went through him. He was Gambino's long-term plan, the future face of the organization. The Della Croce wing ran murder and the street army. Agnello Della Croce controlled the Manhattan and Lower East Side crews, the old Anastasia loyalists, the Blue Goon faction that knew violence better than language. Gambling, heroin, extortion. Della Croce had crews trained to solve problems before the problems learned they had one. Brooklyn was controlled by the old Biondo crew. Rocco Mazzi watched the waterfront. The garment district kicked up steady cash. The area stayed stable only because Gambino kept the former Biondo loyalists from sliding into resentment. Staten Island and New Jersey was the expansion belt. Primarily Della Croce territory. Tight gambling, tight labor, tight loan sharking. Nothing moved unless Neil approved it. And behind it all, Gambino's top hitters kept order. Castellano had Roy DeMeo and his blood-soaked crew. Della Croce had Gotti's young hitters, hungry, ambitious, already making their bones. The Bureau understood exactly what they were looking at. A syndicate with 2 functioning engines, each powerful enough to run the family on its own. Biondo had been the bridge between past and present. His roots went back to Dutch Schultz and Charlie Luciano. When Schultz got taken down, Anastasia inherited part of the empire, and those pieces eventually fell into Gambino's hands. Biondo was the perfect operator, smart, low profile, able to move rackets from prohibition days into a modern economy. But age turned him volatile. Gambino didn't want volatility, so he teased him out. The man who replaced him was the only one who could hold the entire street side together, Agnello Della Croce. By 1965, Della Croce was acting underboss. By 1966, at the La Stella meeting, it became official. He stayed underboss until the day he died in 1985. He never questioned orders. He never talked. And his presence alone stopped problems from breathing. Della Croce represented the old Sicilian hardline, fluent in the dialect, fluent in the street language of New York, and deadly fluent in the way young Sicilian recruits needed to be broken in. They took one look at Neil and understood the rules. The men who ran New York weren't cartoon gangsters. They were carved out of something older and colder. Joseph Riccobono stayed on as advisor, a quiet man on the outside, ruthless on the inside. A broker between the northern families and the southern clans. The newspapers wrote about him during the Appalachian fallout. His silence under questioning, his contempt charge, the way judges kept jailing him because they had nothing else to hit him with. But nobody underestimated Riccobono. His nephew, John Roberts, would later build one of the biggest cocaine networks in Florida, a reminder that the consigliere's bloodline still had teeth. This new layout wasn't just for internal order. It was the blueprint for a takeover. Meat, trucking, garbage, construction, shipping, contracting, the entire skeleton of New York and New Jersey city life. With Colombo quietly under Gambino's thumb and the Bonanno family in free fall after Joe's disappearance, Gambino's reach extended across boroughs, states, and industries. Lucchese was on board. The Genovese administration, Mike Miranda, Gerardo Catena, Philip Lombardo, the Genovese relatives, were aligned, though not loyal. Vito Genovese's people like Russell Buffalino, Meyer Lansky, and Vincent Allo supported the structure. But the Genovese family wasn't just going to fall in line. A cold war began brewing between the two titans, one that would simmer for years. And while the commission maneuvered, Gambino started placing his markers in the place where the real money was trash. After Mount Vernon's incinerator mysteriously burned down in 1964, the city declared an emergency and handed control to private carters. Within months, FBI wiretaps in New Jersey picked up mob bosses chatting about how Carlo Gambino had already taken over the Mount Vernon garbage business. The rackets had their own ecology. Joe Fiola, tied to the old Anastasia garbage empire, disappeared after friction with other mob figures. Wiretaps caught the De Cavalcante family discussing his murder. The Bureau believed Gambino ordered the hit and Jersey handled the mechanics. Fiola was lured to a garage, strangled, stripped, wrapped, and crushed into a metal block by a waste compactor. 42 tons of pressure erased the body and the problem. With Fiola gone, the Mount Vernon contract fell into the hands of James Plastina, a front. Behind Plastina was Joseph Gambino, Carlo's cousin, quietly running the garbage network from the Bronx. When the city needed a hauler, Plastina bid. When the contract renewed, Joseph Gambino negotiated. Bronx River Haulage became Columbus Lease Corp. The trucks changed names. The money didn't. Investigators found Zingaro, a Gambino capo, tied into the operation. Niccolo Melillo, another Gambino soldier, ran trucking out of Queens. The old Westchester contracts moved from one mob-friendly hand to another. Mamaroneck, Mahwah, Ford Motors plant, all touched by the same network. Each time Fiola tried expanding, he stepped on the wrong toes. Each time Melillo positioned himself, someone else got squeezed out. The city officials who opened the door never fully understood who was walking through it. A suspicious fire, an emergency declaration, a no-bid appointment. Documents signed by a DPW commissioner who later became Joseph Gambino's attorney. Companies that dissolved and reappeared under new names. Haulers who subcontracted to haulers who subcontracted to haulers until the money stopped somewhere in Carlo Gambino's pocket. By the end of it, Gambino controlled the garbage of Mount Vernon, Westchester, parts of Queens, and slices of New Jersey, all through fronts, lies, and a network of men who barely appeared on paper. The Bureau knew Fiola was in trouble a month before he vanished. In 1964 and 1965, the FBI had wires buried in the walls of Simone Rizzo, Sam the Plumber, De Cavalcante's office at 21 North Michigan Avenue in Kenilworth, New Jersey. Hidden mics in the ceiling, bugs in the fixtures. Every time the New Jersey boss lit a cigarette, shuffled papers, or cursed about business, it went onto tape and into a file stamped for J. Edgar Hoover's eyes only. On those tapes, starting in March '65, one name kept surfacing in different conversations, in different arguments, wrapped around the same business: garbage. Joey Surprise Fiola. Fiola wasn't some small-time hauler. He was wired into the old Anastasia garbage network an associate of Vincent Squillante, back when Squillante was the self-styled garbage king and godson to Albert Anastasia. By the mid-1950s, Fiola was working Westchester County, setting up a company union for Nicholas Retteni, a soldier in the Vito Genovese family. By 1965, he held a $225,000 contract with the village of Mamaroneck through a company called Advanced Waste Handling Equipment Co., hauling trash to out-of-state dumps instead of letting the village burn it. The numbers were clean on paper. Advanced Waste got $5.65 a ton. The village manager, B.J. Santoro, recommended hiring a private carter instead of sinking $250,000 into fixing the old incinerator. Fiola had his people lined up: his brother Frank, Thomas and Michael Seglio, an accountant named Harold Parker in the Bronx. On the surface, it was just another municipal contract. Underneath it was a mob partnership. At the same time, Gambino's people were sliding into Mount Vernon after a mysterious incinerator fire crippled that city's plant. Emergency powers, no bid hires, sudden shifts from burning to hauling. And in the background, Gambino's cousin Joseph quietly taking over the routes under different company names: Bronx River Haulage, Columbus Lease, plastic names, real money. That overlap, Fiola's Westchester routes and Gambino's new garbage empire, was where the friction started. The bugs caught it first. On March 9, 1965, an FBI source the bureau called NK2461C logged a meeting between De Cavalcante and his capo, Fat Louis Larasso. Larasso complained about delays in setting up a new dump through a land company fronted by a man everyone called the Jew. The property was supposed to be leased for a garbage site. The hold-up, Larasso said, came from internal friction in the Gambino family. Nick Melillo, a Gambino soldier in the garbage trade, and Joe Fiola, spelled phonetically, were at each other's throats. 2 weeks later, another memo crossed an FBI desk in Newark. NK2461C reported that De Cavalcante had met with Nick Melillo, Jimmy Brown Failer, and Carlo Gambino himself. They were putting together a bigger garbage deal: Gambino people, Jersey people, and a spread of partners nobody fully trusted. Larasso told De Cavalcante that Nick had quietly confided the lineup: Joe Bandy, Joseph Biondo, Gambino's underboss, Joe Zingaro, a Gambino capo from Rye, and Joe Fiola were all going to be partners in the same garbage venture that De Cavalcante and Larasso were working. In Mount Vernon, the same names floated around another deal. The thing up there that everyone knew was Gambino territory. Larasso didn't like the math. Too many Gambino partners, not enough Jersey partners. He asked if Biondo was still underboss, if Zingaro was Fiola's capo, if Gambino knew the full partner list. De Cavalcante said he'd check with Carl. Larasso said they'd better, because the last thing they needed was Gambino finding out on his own and deciding they'd gone behind his back. The FBI agent who summarized that conversation wrote it clean. The Jersey boss and his capo were worried about being outnumbered and outvoted by Gambino's people. They didn't have to worry. The only partner who got victimized was Fiola. As the tapes rolled into April, the tone changed. The memos described whispered conversations, words half lost under background radio music, but the important pieces got pulled out: rope, burlap, Ford station wagon. A number was kicked around: 100,000. There was talk of how much money the victim might be carrying, who he'd go to for cash if squeezed, whether he'd see Gambino or his Kappa regime, whether Joe Bandy or another Gambino figure would have to sign off. By April 16th, the Bureau believed a plan was in place. The FBI's Newark office sent a secret report to Hoover. Fiola was in trouble with Carlo Gambino for poaching garbage customers from Joe Colombo in New Jersey. He'd been hustling Ford's plant in Metuchen, trying to carve out territory that other families thought they already owned. Larasso was telling De Cavalcante that a guy named Fiolo kept calling, pushing for a partnership, and he'd stalled him, waiting to see what Sam wanted to do and what Gambino would allow. 3 days later, the tapes caught the setup. On April 19th, 1965, at 5:20 p.m., NK2461C recorded a conversation between De Cavalcante and his cousin and soldier, Robert Basile Occhipinti. They spoke about Louis, about cars, about a garage, about how to lure the man in without making him suspicious. Basile said he and Frank would take Louis back to his car, then meet De Cavalcante at Harriet's office. Harriet Wolfson Gold, Sam's secretary. Sam didn't care about the staging. He cared about logistics. "You gonna put it in the garage?" he asked. Basile said he'd get it in. Sam pressed him. Did he have enough room to work? Did the car fit? Would the guy get suspicious? Basile worried about what it looked like. Sam told him to pop the hood, make it look like they were putting oil in, act like it was nothing. He wanted the station wagon all the way inside. They talked about plates, pliers, and pistols. Basile said the shooter didn't want to use a rope. He preferred his arm, felt better doing it that way. Sam told him to have a rope ready anyway. Basile said the guy had already shown him how he did it, and nearly wrecked him, demonstrating the hold. Money came up again. They joked and worried about how much the victim would be carrying. Basile said he'd keep the cash and give Louis the clothes and shoes. Sam's last instructions were about control. Don't let anybody touch anything they shouldn't. Don't let anyone take anything that wasn't part of the plan. Don't get greedy. Don't get sloppy. He told Basile to make sure the car was pulled in and everything was done right. Basile left the office around 5:30. Sam waited. The tapes caught him fidgeting, opening and closing drawers, mentioning the station wagon again, playing cards with Lou Larasso, killing time at a hand of gin. At one point, he told the room the guy got a heart attack. At another, he muttered that this kind of waiting could drive you nuts. An associate complained he was falling asleep. At 7:28, the phone rang. Sam picked up, listened, then snapped it down and told everyone in Sicilian, "Let's go." The FBI later wrote it plain in their memo to Hoover. Whatever had been planned was now done. A man had been eliminated. The tapes never used Fiola's name on that call, but every lead, every side conversation, every complaint about garbage, customers pointed back to him. The Bureau pieced the rest together from informants and surveillance. That night, a man believed to be Fiola showed up at a garage near De Cavalcante's office in Kenilworth. He was strangled inside, stripped, wrapped in burlap, and loaded into the back of a battered Ford station wagon. His clothes were checked for cash and tossed. The station wagon, with the body inside, was fed into a giant compactor at an unidentified site in New Jersey. 40-plus tons of pressure crushed the car and the corpse into a single block of metal. The next day, De Cavalcante went to a doctor complaining of rectal hemorrhaging. He later told a friend the doctor said it was from too much excitement. On April 21st, 1965, Newark sent Hoover a confidential report spelling it out. They believed Carlo Gambino had authorized the elimination of Joe Fiola, and that De Cavalcante's family had carried it out. The fallout showed up in city ledgers and contract files before it ever hit a case file. After Fiola disappeared, Advanced Waste's Mamaroneck contract went bad. Their favored landfill in North Arlington, New Jersey, run by Anthony Montesano Jr., suddenly shut its gates to them. Hauling to the Croton dump in Westchester cost more and wiped out their margins. Creditors started circling. In August 65, Mid-Hudson Waste Haulage Corp., tied to Thomas Milo of the Genovese family, tried to get the contract transferred. The village refused. By November, the bonding company wouldn't renew Advanced Waste's $50,000 performance bond. In January 1966, the new village manager recommended cancellation. The contract was killed. The village bought Fiola's equipment and transfer station for just over $54,000 and went back into the hauling business itself. On paper, it looked like a failed company and a town taking its services back. In the FBI files, it looked like the aftershock of a mob hit ordered from New York, arranged in New Jersey, and carried out inside a garage that had just enough room to fit a Ford station wagon and a man with his arm around somebody's throat. For Carlo Gambino, it was more than a murder. It was a message to anyone in the garbage trade who forgot who owned which route, which dump, which factory. Joe Colombo's customers stayed Joe Colombo's customers. Gambino's partners stayed Gambino's partners. Everyone else could end up like Fayola, erased, written off as a disappearance, while the contracts, the trucks, and the money quietly rolled into new hands. And in 1964, that was just the beginning. The syndicate was reorganizing, expanding, and settling old scores. The Bonanno power vacuum, the Genovese Cold War, the Castellano succession plan. It all pointed to one thing. Carlo Gambino wasn't just running a crime family anymore. He was engineering a quiet, calculated takeover of the entire metropolitan economy. One garbage truck, one judge, one handshake at a time. When Bumpy Johnson went away on a narcotics beef in 1951, Harlem was still running on old rules. Italians and Irish guarded their corners, the numbers runners worked the tenements, and the cops pretended they didn't see anything as long as the envelopes were right. By the time he walked out in 1963, the world he'd left behind was gone. Kennedy was on television talking civil rights, standing next to Martin Luther King. Black families were moving into the suburbs. In some parts of America, it looked, at least on camera, like there might finally be peace. But down in Harlem, Brooklyn, all those streets where Italians had once brawled with Irish kids and black kids for turf, a different kind of tension was running through the air. The word on the block was simple: Bumpy's back. Everybody wanted to know how he was going to play it. The truth was that the game had moved on without him. The old bosses who'd respected him, the Costello crowd, were fading. But there were still Italians, the old political hands, who looked at Bumpy and saw an asset. A man who could walk into black churches, barber shops, union halls, and deliver votes. With Kennedy talking about justice, those votes were worth more than ever. The pitch was straightforward. Help us rig elections the way we always have, and we'll open doors. They'd give Bumpy access to unions, let him place black workers, give him a visible role in the new America. In return, he'd get a piece of narcotics, a slice of the numbers, a chance to rebuild his own outfit. Same as the old days. As long as the money kicked up to the Italians on schedule, everybody stayed happy. What Bumpy didn't fully see at first was that the Costello era was dead. This was the Genovese era now. The Genovese family owned the numbers. They had their own black muscle. To them, Bumpy wasn't the future. He was an old-timer walking back into a room where the seats had already been taken. They weren't giving anything up. But the Gambinos saw something else. An opening. If they backed Bumpy, gave him quiet support, they could turn Harlem into a proxy front in a cold war with the Genovese family. Keep part of Genovese's attention tied up uptown, bleed off some of their power, keep them distracted, while the Gambinos moved on other fronts. So Bumpy went back to work. With help from certain Italian factions, he moved into the black underworld the way he always had, calm, disciplined, controlled, and started building again. New crews, new angles, new rackets. And somewhere in that rebuilding, he picked up a young driver and bodyguard who watched everything, understood what the Italians were doing, understood what Bumpy was doing, and quietly started sketching out his own plan. His name was Frank Lucas. The old narcotics pipeline was still there, Corsican chemists, Palermo connections, the French connection routes. The old-timers thought they still controlled the flow. What they didn't understand was that war and the CIA were rewriting the rulebook. The agency still used organized crime, especially in the South, but it was also building new relationships in new communities. Black soldiers were being recruited, trained, shipped to places like Vietnam and Central Asia, and some of them stayed behind, learned the terrain, met suppliers, and built their own pipelines. Heroin straight from the source, flown or shipped into the States with intelligence help, then passed to contacts in black neighborhoods. That was the vein Frank Lucas would eventually tap, cutting out Italians who had positioned themselves as middlemen for decades. While that was happening, the Corsicans were getting squeezed. Interpol, British intelligence, European and American agencies were finally sharing information and hitting the same targets. By the early 1970s, the Corsican heroin network that had fed so many Cosa Nostra operations was shattered. That blow didn't just hurt the French. It dented the Italians and cleared space for new players. Latin American cartels, rising black organizations, and a patchwork of other international groups ready to step into the vacuum. The Italian families, under pressure at home and abroad, started tightening up. The government was hammering them on gambling, labor, racketeering, and visible street operations. Judges and politicians, whose palms used to get greased quietly, were suddenly costing twice as much. Every indictment, every committee hearing made corruption more expensive. A lot of that money had to be spent just to hold on to what they already had. Narcotics, the one racket that had once been tightly controlled, started to look like a liability. Too much heat, too many long sentences. So the old syndicates boxed themselves in and, little by little, left the dope game open. Fast money, loose rules. Anyone willing to take the risk could step in. Men like Frank Lucas did. When Lucas came back to his old neighborhood, the Italians were still the dominant force. They controlled unions, construction, the docks, and much of the visible street action. But they were also on their heels. Federal agents, local cops, state investigators, everyone wanted to make a career by putting an Italian name in headlines. The squeeze was real. Wiretaps, grand juries, task forces. The cost of silence went up. The cost of loyalty went up. And that's what gave black crews room to climb. While every lawman in America was staring at Italian names on charts, other groups moved in under the radar. The truth was, when the average American heard the words organized crime, they pictured a guy named Gambino or Genovese, not a guy from Harlem, Colombia, Mexico, or Panama. They didn't realize the CIA had already been teaching international outfits how to move money and product from one continent to another. By the time the 1970s hit, Bumpy Johnson's era was over. The drugs that guys like him dealt in the 40s and 50s were poison, but they still left you a chance. You might kick a habit. You might survive. What Lucas and his generation brought in was different. Pure, cheap heroin flooding the streets. The kind that hollowed people out and killed them quick. There was no coming back from that. Whole neighborhoods disappeared into it. And by then, New York wasn't just corrupt around the edges. It was rotten straight through. Drug money, gambling money, prostitution, porn, all of it kicked up, and not just to wise guys. Mayors, cops, politicians, city workers, everybody got a taste. Even honest cops like Frank Serpico stood no chance in that world. When he opened his door, half the time he saw other officers sitting in kitchens with bookmakers and mob guys, drinking coffee, laughing, breaking bread. The line between crime and government blurred until it was just one big grey smear. The president who'd tried to hit the system head-on, John Kennedy, was dead. The man who might have tried again, Robert Kennedy, was still alive, still talking, still pushing, first as a senator, then as a presidential candidate. People in every neighborhood, not just the black community, hung their last bit of hope on him. Then he was killed too. In the wake of that, the black community was drowned in narcotics. Whatever middle class had been built, the small businesses, the decent city jobs, the families that had scraped their way up, got ripped apart. Industry shipped jobs overseas, factories closed. The economic floor dropped out, and the only thing left to fill the vacuum was dope and fast money. In that world, young guys like John Gotti and the new blood in the Lucchese, Gambino and Genovese factions grew up seeing a different kind of organized crime. They didn't see the old, quiet, handshake deals in back rooms. They saw an entire state where cops, crooks and politicians were all eating at the same table. To them, it wasn't corruption. It was just how things worked. For regular people, there was no winning. If you opened your door, you saw uniforms and wise guys standing side by side. Nobody knew where the law ended and the racket began. Harlem, the place Bumpy had once ruled with a strange mix of toughness and order, started to die. Over the next 30, 40 years, the drugs and the disinvestment did their work. Buildings decayed, families moved out or got buried. Then, when the land was cheap and the damage was done, the cycle flipped. Developers came in with blueprints and talking points. Revitalization, urban renewal, gentrification. The poor got pushed out. The same streets where Bumpy had once walked, where Lucas had once moved dope, where kids had once played on stoops, were suddenly up-and-coming neighborhoods with high-end coffee shops and condos. By the time the dust settled, the Harlem Bumpy Johnson came home to in 1963 wasn't just changed. It was gone. By the mid-1960s, every major boss in New York understood the truth they didn't dare say out loud. The world around them was changing, and it was changing fast. Joe Colombo could feel it. Carlo Gambino sensed it before anyone else. Tommy Lucchese saw it coming in the nervous twitches of his own captains. Even the Genovese hierarchy, usually insulated from panic, recognized the new reality. Men were flipping. Men were snitching. Rival crews, Irish, black, independents, anybody who'd been pushed aside for decades, now discovered that law enforcement wanted to listen to them. Old grudges became leverage. Old resentments became ammunition. A single whisper could wreck a family. Gambino understood the danger better than anyone. After Valachi's testimony tore the veil off Cosa Nostra, the streets were colder and more unpredictable than ever. Gambino still had some of the most sadistic hitters in America. If he sent men after you, you didn't see the sunrise. That was the rule. But rules didn't mean much when an old-timer, someone who'd been around since the wars of Maranzano and Masseria, suddenly decided the 1930s were back, and bosses could be removed like bad teeth. Joe Bonanno was that problem. He'd been a boss before half the table even made captain. He spoke multiple languages, cultivated a polished image, and convinced himself he was superior to the men who now outnumbered and outmaneuvered him. But the world wasn't the same one he remembered, and when he started imagining a return to the old ways, kings crowned overnight, families rearranged at gunpoint, he crossed a line no one was allowed to cross. In 1963, he made the most reckless move in modern mafia history. He entered a secret pact with Joe Magliocco to murder Carlo Gambino and Tommy Lucchese and seize control of the commission. Bonanno wanted absolute power. Magliocco wanted protection and relevance. Both wanted Gambino gone, because Gambino, without raising his voice, was becoming the quiet king of New York. The plan didn't last a week. The man chosen to oversee the hit, Joe Colombo, took one look at the proposal, realized it was a suicide mission, and went straight to Gambino. He betrayed the conspiracy before it even began. Gambino didn't rage. He didn't threaten. He did what he always did. He orchestrated. He called a commission meeting, Magliocco confessed. Bonanno refused to appear. Magliocco was fined and sent into retirement. Bonanno understood immediately that he had stepped into a grave he'd dug himself. Everything that followed, the chaos, the disappearances, the paranoia, all traced back to that moment. The commission ordered him to appear again. He refused. They ordered him a third time. He refused again. No boss had ever done that. A commission summons was gravity. It wasn't optional. The only men who ignored it were men preparing for war or men already on the run. Bonanno wasn't preparing for war. He had simply misread the room. He believed his age, his history, his pedigree, and his intelligence gave him leverage. They didn't. When he moved to Arizona in the mid-50s, he tried to team up with Carlos Marcello and Santo Trafficante, both deeply aligned with Gambino, never imagining that his attempted hit on Gambino meant those bridges would burn. Whatever he thought he could build with them was cut off instantly. It would take years before he and Marcello quietly revived anything together, and even then it happened far away from New York, in the Midwest, where the commission's eyes were softer. Bonanno wasn't finished. He had an escape strategy. He flew in and out of countries, using shell corporations and hand-picked front bosses to build foreign empires, produce markets, restaurants, bars, nightclubs, legitimate businesses masking illegal channels. The profits moved to Switzerland in bags or through silent transfers. He built networks in Canada, Mexico, and across Europe, pockets of wealth that couldn't be touched by the commission. He convinced himself he could wait Gambino out. He convinced himself he could build something stronger. He convinced himself he could exist without New York. In reality, he was digging his own grave. The commission made its position clear. Bonanno was now out of order. If he set foot in New York without authorization, he could be killed on sight. Gambino didn't leave it at that. He quietly used the Valachi testimony, packaging old information with new intel, handing it to the FBI and the newspapers. Summer 1964 became a bloodbath of headlines. Bonanno's hierarchy, his captains, his Canadian operations, his Arizona expansion, even his commission seat. Everything was printed. The public knew more about the Bonanno family in one season than they had learned in 30 years. And while that exposure weakened him, it also gave him a shield. Journalists followed him. Photographers trailed him. FBI agents staked out every building he entered. As long as he lived under a spotlight, killing him was nearly impossible. He became too visible to eliminate without turning it into a public spectacle. But he couldn't operate like before. He needed distance, protection, and a new base of power. He strengthened his Canadian presence with the Cotroni and Rizzuto factions in Montreal. He dug deeper into Arizona, building influence in banking and real estate. He reconnected with Sicilian clans loyal to his old mentor, Genco Russo, and cultivated younger factions rising in Palermo. He began dreaming about replacing the commission altogether, constructing a transnational power base beyond Gambino's reach. Inside his own family, however, a war was brewing. Capos started taking sides. Some wanted the old man back in New York to negotiate. Others believed staying away made him look weak. The cracks deepened when Bonanno began pushing his son, Bill, as his successor. Bill was young, untested, disliked, and resented. His presence turned disagreements into fractures. Gambino and Lucchese didn't hide their feelings. Bill Bonanno would never sit as boss in New York. Bonanno tried to fight through loyalists while retreating into the shadows, but the commission had already moved against him. They stripped him of recognition, declared his family under a caretaker regime, and warned that any attempt to reassert control would be met with force. It was a quiet death sentence. By late summer 1964, Bonanno was surrounded by collapsing fronts. His own family was splitting in half. The commission had written him off, Federal prosecutors were building cases tied to the failed coup. His Canadian allies were beginning to expand independently. The Sicilian balance of power had shifted after their own internal conflicts, leaving his influence there unstable. Everything he had tried to preserve since the failed plot was falling apart faster than he could rebuild it. And then came the 21st of October, 1964. October proved Bonanno hadn't lost his nerve, just his grip. Carlo Gambino had been watching the Bonanno family eat itself alive. The animosity inside the faction was no longer rumor. It was visible. Crews whispered that the old man was finished. Others swore he was still boss in exile. Gambino understood that the only way to truly bring Joe Bonanno down was from the inside. A clean hit might have satisfied some people, but it wouldn't solve the problem. The family had to break itself. That's what the papers would later call the Banana War. Men started choosing sides. Old loyalties cracked. Rackets were suddenly unstable. Gambino had to decide which territories to move on, which to infiltrate quietly, and which to leave alone until the dust settled. Inside the Bonanno family, betrayal and paranoia sat at every table. Then, in October, Gambino picked up a newspaper and saw something that blindsided every boss in New York. Joe Bonanno had disappeared. On paper, it was a kidnapping. In practice, it was a move. In the summer of 1964, the press had dragged Bonanno through headlines, charts, and committee hearings based on Valachi's testimony. He'd been forced into front-page daylight, answering questions about his captains, his businesses, his Arizona ventures, his Canadian ties. Now he was flipping the script. If he staged his own kidnapping, he could drag everyone else into that same light. His captains, his soldiers, his enemies. If he were missing, then the men around him would be subpoenaed, questioned, pulled into grand jury rooms and Senate hearing chambers, forced to explain what they knew. The bosses and their lieutenants would be the ones under scrutiny, not him. Bonanno knew the mafia hated the press more than prison. They could live with indictments. They hated cameras. That October night, the play went into motion. He arrived on Park Avenue in a cab with his lawyer, William Power Maloney, and another attorney. It was raining. They pulled up outside Maloney's building near 36th Street. One lawyer went inside. Maloney stepped toward the doorway. Bonanno was just behind him, a stocky, well-dressed 60-year-old Sicilian who split his time between Brooklyn and a big house in Tucson. Maloney heard a voice behind him. "Come on, Joe. The boss wants to see you." Two men in raincoats were on Bonanno, each with a pistol. They grabbed him and started hauling him down the sidewalk toward 36th Street. Maloney shouted, "Hey, where are you going? He's my client." One gunman snapped back, "Get back and behave yourself," then fired once into the pavement in front of the lawyer. The shot echoed off the avenue. Witnesses later said they heard it, but no shell was ever found. Maloney ran to the corner in time to see a late-model two-door car, beige, lights on, speeding off into the rain. He told police that Bonanno was still struggling as the car pulled away. On paper, which was the last time anyone saw him. The timing was no coincidence. That morning, Bonanno was under subpoena to appear before a federal grand jury probing organized crime. About 30 of his men were reportedly scheduled to testify as well. Valachi had already named him in the Senate as one of the Big Five bosses in New York. The Bureau labeled him a leading Cosa Nostra chieftain, a man who'd been at Appalachian in '57 and narrowly dodged trial afterward by suffering a heart attack on the eve of court. Now, on the very day he was supposed to walk into a grand jury room, he vanished off a Manhattan sidewalk. Police treated it as a real kidnapping. Reporters speculated. Some said it was a hoax, a mob-style sick note to avoid testifying. Others said he was as good as dead, another boss encased in cement or compacted into a block of scrap metal. Assistant Chief Inspector Walter Henning shrugged and gave a bleak line to the press. "You don't find them alive anymore. After all, we've never found Tony Bender." To the public, it looked like another missing mobster. To the underworld, it looked like a message. To Bonanno, it was leverage. In Tucson, where he'd been a quiet presence since the 1940s, people were stunned. There, Mr. Bonanno was a silent citizen who kept to himself, raised a family, invested in real estate, and nodded politely to neighbors. The police chief there had once said during the Valachi hearings that Bonanno never caused trouble, and that if he did, they'd arrest him like anyone else. Bonanno himself joked to a reporter, quoting Will Rogers, that all he knew about crime was what he read in the papers. Behind that calm image was a man who had built a sizable fortune. Garment factories in Brooklyn, a motel in New Jersey, a laundry service, dairy interests in Wisconsin and Colorado, and property spread across the Southwest. His only conviction on paper was a wage and hour violation at a women's coat factory in 1942, for which he'd received a fine and probation. But his police file told a fuller story. Attendance at a Cleveland Mafia meeting in 1928, accusations of running guns for Capone's outfit in Chicago, and a documented presence at Appalachian, where he was caught muddied in a cornfield, claiming his car had broken down and he was just looking for a mechanic. Now the respectable businessman and the hidden boss had merged into one headline: missing. The search spread from New York to Sicily. FBI agents and NYPD detectives interviewed relatives and associates. Circulars went out with his photograph and the line, "Wanted as the alleged victim of kidnapping." They started looking hard at his immediate circle, especially his sons. Salvatore Bill Bonanno, 32, married to a niece of the late Brooklyn boss Joe Profaci, hadn't been seen since before the abduction. His wife refused to talk to police. Joe Jr., 18, briefly disappeared and then casually turned up in Scottsdale, Arizona, walking into his brother's house while FBI agents watched. There was also talk on the street and in law enforcement files that Bonanno and Joe Magliocco had once planned to place Salvatore as head of both their families, effectively making Bill the Prince of Two Kingdoms. That made his absence even more suspicious. Detectives also wanted to speak with Gerardo Jerry Catena and Tommy Ryan Eboli, the acting Genovese bosses named by Valachi. If Bonanno's disappearance was the result of an internal mafia war, the thinking went, the Genovese side might know something. Eboli, in particular, was paying attention. He watched what was happening to Bonanno like a man studying a crime scene photograph, learning exactly what happens when you take a shot at the king and miss. Outside the underworld, Bonanno's vanishing act rattled politics. In New York's Senate race, Robert Kennedy had been struggling against incumbent Kenneth Keating. Many Italian-American voters felt insulted by the Valachi hearings and Keating's attacks, framing the testimony as a Kennedy publicity stunt that smeared all Italians. But when a top underworld figure like Bonanno disappeared in the middle of a grand jury probe, the fantasy that organized crime was just an ethnic insult became harder to sustain. The mob stopped being a stereotype and went back to being a threat. That shift quietly helped Kennedy. Meanwhile, columnists took aim at the American habit of romanticizing gangsters. For decades, the public had treated men like Luciano, Costello, Adonis, Capone, and Mickey Cohen as dark celebrities, foul-mouthed, arrogant, dangerous, but stylish and free. They were the guys who never had a boss chewing them out at 8 in the morning. Movie gangsters and tabloid headlines turned them into characters people almost admired. The disappearance of Joe Bonanno, critics warned, wasn't a movie plot. It was the visible tip of a disease: narcotics, prostitution, extortion, contract killings, the bodies that never turned up, the men strangled or stabbed and tossed into rivers, landfills and car crushers because they saw or heard the wrong thing. A year after that night on Park Avenue, the case was still open. The grand jury was still sitting. The FBI would only say, that an extensive investigation was ongoing. Maloney, the lawyer who had watched his client dragged into a car at gunpoint, told reporters he was as much in the dark as he'd been the night it happened. At one point he told the press he'd been informed Bonanno was alive and well, and would soon appear before the grand jury. The date came and went. No Bonanno. His eldest son, Salvatore, spent 3 months in jail for contempt after refusing to answer questions about that claim. He eventually went back before the grand jury and testified enough to purge the contempt charge, but whatever he said stayed sealed. Other family members, Joe Jr., their sister, now married to a California dentist named Genovese, associates, lieutenants, even rival bosses, were subpoenaed and brought in one by one. Through it all, one thing never changed. There was nobody, no shell casing, no car, no proof of life, no proof of death. From Gambino's point of view, the effect was enough. The Bonanno family was shattered. Its boss was a ghost. Its future was in the hands of men the commission would choose. The Banana War was underway, and Joe Bonanno, whether hiding or buried, had finally been pushed out of the one place he could never quite control: New York. For months after Park Avenue, Joe Bonanno was a ghost. No calls, no sightings, nobody. Just rumors and theories. Dumped in a river, buried on a farm, compacted in a junkyard, living under another name in South America. Then, without warning, he walked back into the story. He reappeared and told the FBI he'd been kidnapped by men he did not know. Nobody believed a word of it. Not the Bureau, not the Commission, not his own people. A boss at his level doesn't get grabbed off a New York sidewalk, held for months, and then stroll back into the city, unharmed, unless the story is his story. And if it was his story, it meant one thing. He had tried to game everybody. His return didn't help him. It made everything worse. From the Commission's perspective, he had survived something he wasn't supposed to survive, and was still refusing to bend the knee. The coup attempt, the disappearance, the defiance, none of it had humbled him. He was still pushing his son Bill as heir, still acting like he could dictate terms from Tucson and Montreal. Inside the Bonanno family, which was the breaking point. Some capos had held their tongues while he was missing, waiting to see if he turned up dead or alive. Once he walked back through the door, they realized 2 things at once. The Commission no longer recognized him as boss, and he was still acting like they had no say in their own future. Loyalty began to fracture in ways you couldn't fix with envelopes or apologies. This was the real beginning of what would be called the Banana War. After his return, Bonanno tried to reassert himself, issuing orders, making moves, speaking as if nothing had changed. It backfired immediately. Crews refused instructions. Capos dodged meetings. Word spread that anyone standing too close to Joe or Bill might end up on the wrong side of history, or the wrong side of a funeral. Bill Bonanno became the lightning rod. To the Commission, he was an unacceptable choice. To half the family, he was a kid who hadn't earned the right to inherit anything. To the other half, he was the bloodline, the old man's chosen successor, and rejecting him meant rejecting everything to which they had sworn. Lines formed, friendships snapped. Men who'd grown up together started carrying guns to sit-downs. 2 factions took shape across the Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, and beyond. On one side, the loyalists, men who still answered to Joe and Bill, who believed the old man had been wronged, and that the Commission had overstepped. On the other side, the faction around Gaspar Di Gregorio, a veteran capo with quiet backing from Gambino and Lucchese, chosen precisely because he was predictable, controllable, and didn't come with a son the Commission hated. Gambino and Lucchese made their move. They declared Di Gregorio the legitimate head of the Bonanno family in New York. It wasn't just an internal adjustment. It was a public statement inside the underworld. Joe Bonanno's reign in New York was over. For Bonanno, it was pure humiliation. To go from recognized boss and commission member to an exile watching his own family handed to a rival was worse than a conviction. In the logic of that world, your power exists where your feet stand. His feet were in Arizona and Canada. New York belonged to somebody else. Through the summer and into October 1965, that reality hardened. The commission rejected his authority outright. His family split into armed camps. Street soldiers and button men picked sides and carried that choice into bars, social clubs, and parked cars. Every decision Bill made seemed to inflame things further. Every attempt by Joe to speak as boss only reminded people that the bosses in New York, Gambino, Lucchese, the Genovese leadership, no longer recognized him. The Di Gregorio faction started moving on the day-to-day work. Collections, loans, gambling spots, union points, Shylock books, whoever was willing to pay tribute to the new regime. The Bonanno name was still on the door, but the man who'd built it no longer controlled the office. By October 1965, Joe Bonanno was politically finished in New York. He still had money. He still had properties. He still had influence in Arizona, in Montreal, and quiet ties in Sicily. But the streets of New York, the place that had made him, the place he had once tried to rule above all others, were out of his hands and in the grip of a war that now carried his name. The loyal Bonanno men still standing in New York were in no shape to take on the commission-backed Di Gregorio faction. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and outconnected. Every social club, every restaurant back room, every union office suddenly felt like enemy territory. The commission had made its choice, and once that verdict came down, the street followed without hesitation. But Joe Bonanno had something the commission didn't account for. He had a ghost waiting in a cage. Carmine Galante. Galante was sitting in prison with a grudge that burned hotter every year. He blamed everybody. The Genovese family for selling him out, Gambino for cutting off his lanes, Frank Costello for burying him long before the courts did. Galante didn't need permission. He didn't need a pep talk. All Bonanno had to do was stay alive long enough for the gate to open. When Galante finally stepped out, he didn't give a speech, didn't call a meeting, didn't look for allies. He went straight for symbolism. His first act was to blow up Frank Costello's mausoleum. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't quiet. It was a declaration aimed at every old-timer from Brooklyn to the Bronx. Galante was telling them the past wasn't buried, and if they thought it was, he'd dig it up and scatter it across the cemetery. War was back on the table, and now every boss in New York had to consider the one thing they'd hoped to avoid. Carmine Galante unleashed, and Joe Bonanno suddenly relevant again. For the first time since his disappearance, Bonanno felt the balance shift. Galante gave him something no capo, no shell corporation, no Montreal pipeline ever could, a street presence. A reminder that the Bonanno name still carried teeth. Meanwhile, Carlo Gambino had a question eating at him like acid. Why wasn't a single Genovese soldier on Vernon's hit list? It made no sense. If somebody wanted to destabilize New York, the Genovese family should have been dead center in the crosshairs. Instead, they were untouched, clean, invisible, too invisible. It smelled wrong. To Gambino, the answer was simple. The Genovese family had an inside man, somebody who knew where the bodies were supposed to fall and quietly stepped his people out of the blast radius. And the moment Gambino thought about who had the ambition and the nerve to pull something like that, he landed on the same name every time, Tommy Eboli. Every instinct told Gambino that Eboli wasn't just maneuvering. He was preparing for something. He had the temperament, the connections, the ego, and the timing. And if the Genovese weren't on a list where they should have been, then Eboli either wrote the list or made sure somebody else erased his part of it. Gambino didn't say it publicly. He didn't need to. In his world, suspicion was a sentence, and once he believed Eboli was behind an inside play, The clock started ticking. Now the commission wasn't just dealing with the Bonanno collapse. It was staring at a quiet fracture inside the Genovese family, a crack that would eventually widen into a silent, deadly power struggle. Galante was back. Bonanno had hope. The streets were shifting, and Carlo Gambino, the quiet king of New York, was suddenly wondering if the next war wouldn't come from Arizona or Montreal, but from across the table. Thomas Eboli always presented himself as a man who kept things simple. A neighborhood face, a village businessman, a guy who claimed he knew nothing about the darker currents swirling around him. But the FBI files told a different story. When he sat down for an interview in 1958, he casually mentioned he had 4 brothers spread across the East Coast: Patsy on Bleecker Street, John on Thompson Street, who had recently vanished to an unknown address, Louis somewhere in Pennsylvania, and Ralph out on Long Island. A scattered family, but all close enough to hear whispers. By 1960, Eboli was moving like a man who expected to live forever. He applied for a passport in New York City, number 2485114, and made it clear he planned to disappear into Europe for a while. Italy, Spain, France, Switzerland, Germany, England. No stated return date. The kind of trip you take when you want to shake hands, rebuild ties, or check on old debts. He wrote on the application that he was born June 13th, 1911 in Italy, and had come to the United States as a boy in March of 1912. He'd lived between New York and Chicago ever since, and only recently, in August of 1960, had he become a naturalized American citizen. His certificate of naturalization, number 8216086, gave him the legal freedom to move anywhere he wanted. According to the informant, that passport could now be used as often as he liked, without reporting anything to the State Department. In February 1962, he slipped down to Miami. No reason given. No reason needed. Eboli liked to pretend he grew up in the shadow of saints. He said he spent his childhood in Greenwich Village with Anthony Tony Bender Strollo and Vito Genovese, as if they were just neighborhood boys who played stickball on the same block. He insisted he never did business with either of them, never touched a racket they were involved in, and knew nothing about their operations. If he saw Genovese socially, that was all it was. Social. He claimed the same thing about Strollo. It sounded clean, but nothing in his life was ever clean. He admitted he'd made good money with Michael Genovese, Vito's brother, through the Trian cigarette service. He said the payout was around $128,000. The company employed another Genovese brother, Carmine, and he insisted none of the 3 ever kicked up to Vito or Strollo. According to him, Trian never paid off a union man, never greased a palm. A miracle in an industry built on bribes. He said his real business was the Burger Village restaurant at 406 6th Avenue, running under the name Village Taffies, Inc. He'd been operating it since September 1956. A harmless front, clean enough to look legitimate, profitable enough to keep the taxmen satisfied. But by late 1962 and early 1963, the Bureau began picking up chatter that pushed Eboli straight back into the Genovese orbit. Investigators learned that Angelo Ray DiCarlo and Little Pussy Russo were talking non-stop about Eboli. His personality, his authority, his ambitions inside the Genovese structure. With Vito locked up in Leavenworth, the underboss, Gerardo Catena, was holding the family together with Philip Lombardo, Mike Miranda, and the rest of the Ivy League. The name agents gave the Genovese hierarchy because their sons went to college while they went to prison. A power struggle was brewing. DiCarlo and Russo were quietly aligning themselves with the old-school muscle, Ruggero Boiardo and Mike Miranda, while trying to keep the peace until Vito's appeal was decided. Nobody wanted to pick a side too early. but everyone knew one wrong move could trigger a war. Eboli was right in the middle of it. Russo even said that if Genovese never walked out of prison, he'd carve his own lane and make his own way. He hinted that Miranda planned to win Catena over if anything happened to Vito. If the courts didn't free him, Miranda and Catena would step into power, and Tommy Ryan, meaning Thomas Eboli, would be lucky to be remembered at all. Eboli was also trying to figure out who he could trust outside New York. He spent late 1962 asking questions about a man the informants only called La Rosa or La Russo, wanting to know whether the guy was a thief, a wise guy, or something else entirely. He showed the same caution everywhere he went. When he met Catena at the Route 46 diner in Ridgefield, New Jersey, he arrived early, swept the place with his eyes, studied every customer, and positioned himself in a booth near the rear, isolated from the crowd. It was the behavior of a man who lived by his instincts, and trusted none of them. Meanwhile, Boston was stirring. Gennaro Angiulo was opening new operations on Tremont Street, above Jay's Lounge, and talking openly about Tommy Ryan, and a man described only as the Jew. The Bureau called Angiulo a top lieutenant of Raymond Patriarca, a major figure in New England's underworld. On February 14th, 1963, Angiulo flew into New York with a companion named Limoni. They moved like men running a careful errand. LaGuardia, Western Union on 52nd Street, the Rivoli Shoe Repair on 7th Avenue, the Park Sheraton Hotel, and finally D'Angelo's Italian restaurant on West 55th. Surveillance caught a white 1961 Cadillac with New Jersey plates pulling up outside. The driver was identified as Thomas Eboli, 5'7", 165, black topcoat, blue hat. A second man, white, about 5'5", 150, grey suit, no hat, stayed in the car. Eboli entered D'Angelo's with another unknown man. At 5:45, they stepped back out. The companion walked west on 55th. Eboli headed north on 8th Avenue to the Cadillac, climbing in with the same precision he had shown at the diner. By 7 o'clock, Angiulo and Limoni were back at LaGuardia, boarding the shuttle to Boston. Then came the twist. Surveillance revealed that the Tommy Ryan Angiulo had been discussing was actually Thomas Eboli himself. 2 days later, on February 16th, Jen Catena met with Eboli about a company called Spectronics, a West Virginia optical lens operation that had drawn in Catena's group Eboli and others. Ryan's investment was around $20,000. Catena said the company was in trouble, assets gone, money burned. But one informant thought he could salvage $68,000, enough to quiet Ryan and buy time. Ryan didn't want time. He wanted blood. He was quoted telling one informant that he'd kill the man responsible if the money wasn't repaid. Catena replied that he was willing to let Ryan have priority, not the profits, but the vengeance. It was the kind of conversation that didn't make it into restaurant ledgers or partnership agreements. It made it into FBI reports, stamped and classified, because it showed exactly who Eboli was, a man who claimed innocence at every turn, yet lived in a world where a lost investment justified murder. And behind it all, he still walked into commission meetings with a smile, pretending he was untouched by the storm he helped create. Carlo Gambino could feel the tension bleeding out of the Genovese family long before anybody said it aloud. The split had been festering for years, men who still swore loyalty to Lucky Luciano, and men who would follow Vito Genovese straight into a pit. That kind of fracture was gold to Gambino. All he had to do was slip into the cracks and widen them. But you had to understand who the Genovese outfit really was. This wasn't some street crew holding on to a handful of corners. Luciano's old structure was built out of legends. They ran industries behind velvet curtains. They owned the night, and the nightclub world was the perfect example. The Copacabana wasn't just a place to drink or see a show. It was a machine. You could push booze that cost pennies and sell it for dollars. You could book talent, run gambling tabs, move dope through the back door, or set up marks who didn't even know they were marks. Most importantly, the Copa was a blackmail factory. Politicians, bankers, showgirls, hustlers. You had everything you needed under one roof, including leverage. Jewish and Italian organized crime controlled almost every exclusive club in Manhattan, but the Genovese family had the strongest grip. And behind that grip was Sammy "Red" Levine. Samuel Levine. The same man who'd helped kill Maranzano for Luciano. He'd become a quiet powerhouse in the union world and one of the original hands steering the Copacabana alongside Jules Padel. Under Vito Genovese, these operations expanded into a multi-purpose engine: skimming, loan sharking, entertainment contracts, political influence, favors on demand. But when Vito went to prison, the command structure inside the family shattered. Depending on the month, you had Catena, Eboli, or Mike Miranda acting as boss. Sometimes Lombardo. Sometimes all of them. Every man was powerful enough to run the family, but none strong enough to unify it. And when a family drifts like that, sharks smell blood. Gambino slipped in quietly. It started with investors tied to him, then earners, then doormen, then entertainment contracts. Before long, Gambino's fingerprints were on parts of the skim. It was subtle, silent, but unmistakable. The kind of thing that drove Tommy Eboli up the wall. Eboli told anyone who would listen that the Genovese were losing their grip. He blamed the bosses upstairs, blamed disorganization, blamed Gambino, blamed outsiders, sticking their beaks in our bowl. His words. He felt pushed aside in his own house. And that wasn't the only insult. Gambino had moved into the blackmail rackets in a way no other Italian boss had ever dared. While most men stayed away from anything involving the gay underground, too risky, too taboo, Gambino walked straight into it. He infiltrated the nightclubs, the after-hours scenes, the hidden bars, and built a blackmail system so effective it spread into Manhattan courtrooms and Albany offices before anyone realized what he was doing. It wasn't just politicians he held leverage over. It was entire families with century-old names, banking dynasties, political dynasties. The Genovese men had run that angle for years, quietly, discreetly. Now Gambino had one foot inside their Jewish pipeline, and the clearest proof of that was Roy Cohn. Roy was supposed to be untouchable, a creature of the underworld elite. But Gambino had him on a leash, and lent him out to Fat Tony Salerno, Carmine Galante, and even Genovese associates when it suited him. That alone told the Genovese hierarchy that something had shifted at the top of the mafia food chain. Then there was Angelo Bruno, a long memory for every man in the Genovese circle. Bruno's original boss, Joe Ida, was tightly connected to the Genovese machine. Ida sat with Vito Genovese and Russell Bufalino at Appalachian. He was part of that world. When Ida left the country, Bruno took over Philadelphia, and instead of falling in line with the Genovese faction the way tradition demanded, he turned toward Gambino. To the old guard inside the Genovese family, men like Funzi Thierry, Mike Miranda and others, this was betrayal. Russell Bufalino had influence with the Genovese people, sure, but he wasn't enough to cover Bruno's shift. As years passed and Gambino's influence expanded, Bruno's independence became unforgivable. So, while the papers wrote about unity and the commission gave the illusion of order, the reality was simple. The Genovese family was boiling. Internal loyalties to Luciano, Vito, Miranda, Lombardo, Catena, all of it collided with Gambino's rising power. And Tommy Eboli, unpredictable and violent, was the worst possible lightning rod. He had the temper of a street enforcer and the ego of a boss. He couldn't be trusted to stay quiet, and everyone knew it. By 1965, with Valachi secrets out in the open, the Genovese leadership started scrambling. Mike Miranda, Luciano's old ally, Lansky's old friend, Vito's trusted consigliere, took charge behind the scenes. He was joined by men like Antonio Carrillo, a longtime lieutenant, and Philip Lombardo, the real hidden power in the family. Gerardo Catena held Newark like a fortress. Ruggiero Boiardo ruled with brutality. Tony Boiardo, fast, vicious, utterly loyal, enforced it with other men like Jimmy Blue Eyes. This was the Ivy League of organized crime, educated sons, lawyers, doctors, accountants, men building empires that crossed oceans. They were too big to crush, too rich to corner, too spread out for any one faction to choke. They operated in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Miami, Detroit, New Orleans, the Dominican Republic, Brazil, London, Paris, Sicily. They didn't just run Italians. They ran whoever made money, Irish, Jewish, anyone. But inside all that power was a fracture no one could ignore. Gambino sensed it. Eboli lived it. Miranda tried to control it. And sooner or later, someone was going to light the fuse. This was the beginning of a quiet, grinding Cold War between the two biggest criminal syndicates in America. And everyone understood one thing. When the Genovese family fought among themselves, the whole underworld shook. By January 1965, the search for Joe Bonanno had become another piece of underworld theater the whole country could watch, but nobody could touch. On January 20th, the Chicago Tribune ran a story that said more between the lines than it did in print. Sam Momo. Giancana, Chicago's boss and one of the quiet powers on the National Commission, had just gone before a New York federal grand jury for the fourth time. 30 minutes on the stand, no visible emotion, no real answers. Officially, the jury was probing the October 21st kidnapping of Joseph Joe Bananas Bonanno, who'd been snatched off Park Avenue 2 hours before he was supposed to testify before that same panel. Unofficially, everyone knew they were really probing the way the commission did business. The grand jury wanted to know if Giancana had been part of a deal, Bonanno's safe return in exchange for stepping away from certain rackets in New York and Tucson, and guaranteeing that his family would eat for the rest of their lives. The government believed some version of that offer had been discussed on January 12th at the Long Island estate of Tommy Three-Finger Brown Lucchese, where Giancana sat down with Eastern bosses, underbosses, and emissaries. Giancana wasn't the only one marching in and out of that jury room. Salvatore Bill Bonanno, the son, appeared so often he might as well have had his own locker in the hallway. He was on his 9th trip when the Tribune caught up with him. Gerald the Cat Catena, the New Jersey gambling and vice boss, came in under subpoenaed silence, along with his lieutenant Tommy Eboli. Catena was the acting hand for Vito Genovese, still calling shots from a narcotics cell in Leavenworth. On paper, they were all there to help solve a kidnapping. In reality, they were there because the government wanted to know who would own New York when the smoke cleared. A month later, the hunt for a new Bonanno boss moved from the grand jury room to the back of a Manhattan restaurant. On February 11th, while ordinary people ate lunch at D'Angelo's on West 55th Street, a different kind of business meeting was going on at a rear table. Men slipped in one by one or two at a time, trying not to arrive in a pack that would spook the cops already watching the street. There was Tommy Ryan, Eboli, now acting boss for the Genovese interests. With him, his close associate Rocco Perotta. Carmine Mr. Gibbs Tramunti, a top lieutenant for Lucchese. Matteo Valvo of Brooklyn, a former suspected underboss for Bonanno. Frank Funzi Thierry, the cold-blooded strategist. Gaspar Di Gregorio, a rising Bonanno capo from West Babylon. A few more faces the papers couldn't yet tag with names. On the surface, it was just lunch. In reality, They were carving up a man who wasn't even confirmed dead. They talked about Bonanno's territory, his narcotics lines, his loan sharking books, and his gambling operations. They weighed who could replace him, who could be trusted to run the family, and how to keep the money flowing with the least amount of blood. The police and the FBI had their own theory. First, they thought Bonanno was dead. Then they started to believe what the whispers said. That he was alive, in hiding on orders from the commission, maybe somewhere in Mexico, maybe drifting between Long Island and upstate safe houses, keeping out of sight while the Grand Council decided whether he lived, died, or retired on their terms. His sons, Joseph Jr. and Salvatore, were dragged again and again in front of the grand jury, along with Francesco Manza, the owner of the Villa Capra in Cedarhurst, and whatever Long Island hoodlums the Bureau could lay hands on. While the press chased kidnappings and mystery meetings, a handful of columnists started to describe the bigger picture. Victor Riesel, working off reports from J. Edgar Hoover and Senator John McClellan, told readers something the government itself was just beginning to admit out loud. There was a national crime syndicate, and it wasn't a rumor. According to those reports, a 12-man commission sat at the top. They weren't street toughs, they were millionaire criminals. One of them had even been tied to wartime treason. This commission decided policy, settled disputes, and regulated territory. Under them were about 2,000 executives who ran local families, dummy unions, narcotics routes, and gambling operations. Below that came the rank and file, an underworld workforce of roughly 750,000 men. The mob, Riesel wrote, was handling around $40 billion a year. Half of that commission, and hundreds of those executives, had their hands buried in labor racketeering. The syndicate wasn't just shaking down bookmakers and corner bars. It was sitting on pension funds, welfare funds, construction contracts, and urban renewal projects. It was already planned for the day when narcotics and illegal gambling would face real federal heat. When that day came, the mob intended to be waiting in the boardrooms and union halls, not the pool halls. Look at New York, and you could see what Riesel meant. The Gambino family, one of 5 that controlled the city and Long Island, had 69 active topside men. 12 of them, including the boss, the underboss, and key lieutenants, were dug into labor. All had records for extortion and muscle work. The Genovese family, the largest in the city and by some counts the entire country, had 115 active members, with at least 18 specializing in labor rackets. Lucchese's outfit was smaller but heavy. 45 active leaders, a dozen tied directly to unions. Chicago had its own combine, about 100 hardcore activists under a 19-man ruling council, with at least 5 handling labor accounts. One of those 19, the testimony said, was Teamsters official Joey Glimko, who somehow kept his local office even after his ties were aired in public hearings. Inside that same group sat the man many believed would one day replace Vito Genovese as head of the National Commission, Sam Momo Giancana. Detroit and Windsor had their own numbers, 61 active leaders, 9 confirmed labor racketeers, 2 sitting on the ruling council. City to city, coast to coast, from Tampa up to the Canadian border, the pattern was the same. A handful of families, a dozen commission members, and thousands of executives were running what Riesel started calling the second government. Valashi's testimony had embarrassed them, but it hadn't broken them. There were a few retirements, a few funerals, some natural, some not, but the machine itself kept running. By the fall of 1965, the Justice Department tried to show it understood the scale of what it was up against. Nicholas Katzenbach, the Attorney General, called 92 regional attorneys general to Washington. They met in the Great Hall, under marble and frescoes, to talk about labor racketeering, loan shark operations, crooked bankruptcies, factoring schemes, arson rings, and the syndicates behind all of it. Katzenbach told them the war had only just begun. On his desk, he kept a file of 2,300 top racketeers, men like Johnny Dio and their sponsors, including Tommy Three-Finger Brown Lucchese. Behind those files sat a card index of 250,000 names, tracking investments, partnerships, girlfriends, relatives, and shell corporations. 15 federal grand juries were at work on organized crime. The hardest-hitting 3 were in the Southern District of New York, under U.S. Attorney Robert Morgenthau. Morgenthau's people were patient. They worked like auditors, not cowboys. Piece by piece, they put together a picture of the Cosa Nostra that went beyond what Valachi had drawn. Valachi's chart for the Bonanno group listed 21 names. Morgenthau had more than 5 times that, and he was still counting. In the middle of all this, one old name kept resurfacing: Johnny Dio. Dio was 57, an ex-con, a labor racketeer with a reputation for acid remarks and blindside violence, and a long-time penitentiary friend of Vito Genovese. In the 50s, he'd been the phantom behind dummy Teamsters locals and beatings of reporters. Now, as several Cosa Nostra chiefs fell ill with heart problems and age, Dio was quietly moving back into position. Riesel described it plainly. Dio was ready to take his place in the highest councils of the Cosa Nostra and move the mafia back into labor. On the surface, Dio's life looked almost legitimate. He had a partnership in a mid-Manhattan novelty advertising firm that sold pens, pencils, and cigarette lighters with custom messages. He had interests in the meat business. But the Justice Department didn't care about his lighters or his beef. What caught their attention was the old pattern returning. Men who once helped Dio front dummy unions were popping up again. One of them, Sidney Hodes, had gone from being president of 2 Teamsters locals and secretary-treasurer of another, all at the same time, to becoming the well-paid business agent of Teamsters Local 875 in a New York suburb, a union that supposedly represented rug cleaners, dyers, drivers, and shop workers. They were organizing small businesses. The question federal investigators kept asking was simple. Was this just one union, or the tip of another nationwide penetration into the labor movement? Morgenthau's grand juries, while digging into the Lucchese empire, tripped over Dio's trail again and again. At the same time, they uncovered another quiet development. The man who had stepped into Joe Bonanno's shoes after Carmine Galante. His name was John Joseph Morale, a fugitive from an old army desertion charge who'd spent 22 years in the wind. The FBI finally found him living comfortably in a New York suburb. He made bail, $50,000, and walked out described by Morgenthau as the acting head of the Bonanno operation, which now stretched from New York to Buffalo, across the Southwest, and out to the coast. So, while newspapers sold the drama of one missing boss and whispered about whether Joe Bananas was dead or alive, the reality was uglier and much bigger. Giancana was flying in from Chicago to sit down at Long Island Estates and answer questions in grand jury rooms. Eboli, Catena, and Di Gregorio were meeting in restaurants to pick new kings. Gambino's Combine and the Genovese Empire fought for control over unions, nightclubs, and blackmail pipelines. Johnny Dio climbed back into the labor rackets just as the Justice Department tried to chart a war it barely understood. On the surface, it looked like business as usual. Underneath, the second government of the United States, the one with a 12-man commission and 750,000 soldiers, was adjusting its books, swapping out its front men, and making sure that no matter who disappeared off Park Avenue, the money kept moving. By 1965, everything Tommy Lucchese had built was starting to tilt on him. The first sign wasn't a war or an indictment, it was the headaches. They came early, before breakfast, a pressure behind the eyes that made him grip the edge of the sink and wait for it to pass. Then it got worse. A simple cough bending to tie his shoes, stepping out of a car. Any little movement sent a jag of pain through his skull, like somebody had wired his brain to a live line. Even the FBI could see it. The same agents who'd spent years tailing him began writing that Tommy looked smaller, slower, and unsteady on his feet. He started missing the odd lunch, then the odd dinner. For a man who had spent 30 years holding court in restaurants, which was as loud as a gunshot. The doctors finally gave it a name: brain tumor. After that, Lucchese stopped kidding himself. He stayed close to his daughters and his house out at Lido Beach. He left more of the day-to-day to his people: Carmine Tramunti on the street, Eddie Sasso on the money, and waited for the man who had to come: Carlo Gambino. They picked a quiet afternoon. No big entourage, no show. Just two old men from Palermo who had somehow lived long enough to become the board of directors of American organized crime. Tommy was thinner now, a cardigan over his shoulders, slippers instead of shoes. Gambino noticed he gripped the arm of the chair when he stood, like the floor might shift on him. For a moment they didn't talk about business at all. They talked about home, the old village, the faces that were gone. First Benny, Tommy said, meaning Bugsy Siegel, the kid they'd watched turn Hollywood into a racket and then get taken out when he forgot who owned the casino. Then Willie Moretti, then Albert. Anastasia's name hung there. Tommy had liked a lot of them, even when he signed off on their deaths. That was the life. It still bothered him anyway. But Charlie, he said quietly, that one hurt. Lucky Luciano had been more than a boss. He was the architect. Tommy had been his field general. When word came from Naples in '62 that Luciano had dropped dead at the airport, Lucchese had taken it like a family death notice. He looked at Gambino now and gave a tired half-smile. I thought he'd always be there to straighten it out, Tommy said. Him, me, then you. Like the old men back home, sitting in front of the cafe, telling the kids what not to do. Gambino didn't say it out loud, but he understood exactly what was being handed to him. Lucky was gone. Costello was fading. Genovese was rotting in Leavenworth. Now Lucchese was telling him, without saying the words, that his own clock was running out. What did they say? Carlo asked. Tumor, Tommy answered. They'll cut. Maybe it buys time, maybe it doesn't. Either way, I'm not going to be sitting in the back of the Copacabana every night breaking balls anymore. He let that sit a second, then went back to business. You're going to have to deal with my people, he said. Rao, Tramunti, Mike Miranda. They'll listen to you if you respect the setup. No more cowboys like Bonanno. No more surprises. Gambino nodded. For all the power he'd accumulated, he still thought of himself as the quiet nephew who'd worked his way from Brooklyn docks to the inner circle. Now the circle was almost empty, and he was being told, in a living room on Long Island, that the future of the whole thing was going to land in his lap. What's it all worth, Carlo? Tommy asked, not in a bitter way, just tired. We come from nothing, we build this thing, we outlive half of them, and it ends with doctors and grand juries, same as everybody else. Gambino shrugged in that small Sicilian way that meant everything and nothing. It's worth that we did it our way, he said, and that we die in our own beds. It was the closest either of them ever came to philosophy. While Lucchese was waiting on his own verdict, the rest of the country was trying to figure out what to do with men like him. On January 20th, 1965, Sam Momo Giancana walked into a federal building in New York for the 4th time and took the elevator up to a grand jury room that wanted to know what had happened to Joe Bonanno. The Chicago boss had spent a quiet day the week before at Tommy Lucchese's Long Island estate, Villa Capra, sitting with Carlo Gambino's people, the Genovese people, and various emissaries, talking about the same thing everybody in the life was talking about where Bonanno was, whether he was alive, and how to divide his world if he didn't come back. The government thought Giancana might know about a deal, Bonanno's safe return in exchange for surrendering rackets in New York and Tucson. They dragged in his son Bill again. They dragged in Jerry Catena, the Genovese underboss. They dragged in Tommy Eboli. Every time the elevator doors opened, another piece of the commission stepped out, blinking under fluorescent lights. A few weeks later, on February 11th, the search for Bonanno's replacement moved to D'Angelo's, a restaurant on West 55th Street. Outside, plainclothes cops leaned in doorways and sat in parked cars. Inside, at a back table, in a private room that was anything but, they had one of those quiet sit-downs that meant more than any headline. Tommy Eboli was there, standing in for Vito Genovese. So was Rocco Perotta, out of New York. Carmine, Mr. Gibbs. Tramunti came in for the Lucchese side. Matteo Valvo, an old Bonanno underboss, showed his face. Frank Funzi Thierry sat listening more than talking, the way he always did. Gaspar Di Gregorio, the commission's candidate to replace Joe Bananas, took his place at the table. They talked about narcotics, Shylock money, gambling territories, and who would get what when Bonanno was officially written off. On paper, the country was at war with these men. In Washington, President Johnson was reading reports from J. Edgar Hoover and Senator John McClellan that made even a Texas politician blanch. The numbers were simple and ugly. A national crime syndicate, run by a 12-man commission. About 2,000 mid-level executives underneath. Around 750,000 men on the street, running dice games, card rooms, dope routes, bookmaking phones, construction scams, and union shakedowns. $40 billion a year moving through what the newspapers called the second government. McClellan's investigators broke it down by family. In Gambino's Brooklyn outfit, 69 made men, a dozen of them wired deep into labor rackets. In the Genovese organization, the biggest of all, 115 soldiers, at least 18 working full-time inside unions and pension funds. In Lucchese's crew, 45 active leaders, a dozen of them living off labor. In Chicago, about 100 activists, 5 of them specialists in labor racketeering, reporting up to a 19-man ruling panel. One of those 19 was Sam Giancana, already being mentioned as the logical successor to Genovese on the National Commission, if Vito's health gave out before his sentence did. The message from Washington was clear. They were coming at the narcotics, the gambling, the skims. The message from the underworld was just as clear. Fine, then we'll move into construction, urban renewal, Teamster locals, welfare and pension funds. If the government wanted to shut down the dice games, the mob would simply move to the building site that went up on top of them. By the fall of 1965, another name started showing up in those reports again, Johnny Dio. The same acid-tongued fixer who had run the dummy union racket with Jimmy Hoffa, the same guy who'd sent reporters to hospitals with acid in their faces, was back in Midtown after a stretch in Atlanta, where he'd been a yardbird alongside Joe Valachi. Now he was fronting a novelty firm in Manhattan, selling pens, lighters, and gimmicks, and quietly sliding back into labor, consulting. He had a meat business on the side, muscle disguised as beef, and the full backing of Tommy Lucchese's people and the Genovese crowd. Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach had a file with 2,300 names like his, cross-indexed on 250,000 cards. 15 federal grand juries were working rackets cases around the country. 3 of the toughest panels were in the Southern District of New York under Robert Morgenthau, a prosecutor who was starting to know more about the commission's internal chart than Valachi himself ever did. Morgenthau's people found the man who took over the Bonanno operation when Carmine Galante vanished and Joe stayed in the wind, John Joseph Morale, a deserter from the army who'd been living comfortably in the suburbs for 2 decades. They dragged him into court on an old military case and called him what he really was, acting head of a family that now stretched from New York to Buffalo and out to the Southwest. The same grand juries that were mapping the Lucchese empire kept tripping over Johnny Dio's footprints. Old Teamster hands like Sidney Hodes popping up again as business agents in suburban locals. Organising rug cleaners and wastepaper drivers who just happened to sit on top of valuable real estate and trucking lines. While all this was going on, Tommy's headaches were getting worse. By 1966, he was rarely seen outside the Lido beach house. When he did go out, he walked like the floor wasn't level. People who'd watched him glide through nightclubs for years now saw him gripping the backs of chairs and leaning on a cane. He delegated more and more to Carmine Tramunti and Eddie Sasso, kept Mike Miranda as his counselor, and stayed close to the phone. The commission understood what was coming, even if nobody said it out loud. A boss that sick couldn't sit at the head of the table forever. Somebody had to be groomed to take the seat without starting a war. That's what led to La Stella. On September 22nd, 1966, at 4 in the afternoon, 13 men sat around a long table in a private basement room of La Stella restaurant on Queens Boulevard in Forest Hills. On the surface, it looked like a late lunch. Good food, wine flowing, jokes, handshakes. In reality, it was a small-scale national summit. What the papers would later call Little Appalachian. Tommy Eboli was there, Vito Genovese's stand-in, the man everybody expected to front the family until Vito died or was sprung. Carlo Gambino was there, the quiet king, already treated like chairman of the board. Mike Miranda came as Lucchese's underboss, the 70-year-old elder statesman who'd been with Luciano since the early days. Joe Colombo showed up, the one-time Profaci soldier who had climbed into the boss's chair in Brooklyn after a well-timed betrayal. Carlos Marcello flew in from New Orleans, the little man who controlled Louisiana politics like a personal fiefdom. Santo Traficante came up from Miami, the exiled gambling czar of pre-Castro Cuba. Around them sat the so-called lesser lights. Don Alonghi, a soldier. Joseph Gallo, not Crazy Joe from Brooklyn, but another Gallo who worked under Gambino. Agnello della Croce, the underboss of the Gambino family. Anthony Tony the Chic Carrillo of Forest Hills, who spoke for Louisiana interests and the West Coast people tied to Frank Gagliano, Anthony Carollo, and Joseph Marcello. 3 more lower-ranked figures rounded out the table, men whose names would mean little outside the case files, but who carried the messages and the money back to their own corners of the map. The agenda was simple and explosive. Pick the heir to a dying Gaetano Tommy Lucchese and adjust the gambling and Shylock territories to match reality, from Queens all the way down to the Caribbean. The consensus choice, already quietly agreed on by the people who mattered, was Vincent John Rao. Lucchese's longtime advisor, a man who lived in Westchester, worked out of East Harlem, and knew the family's numbers better than any accountant. What none of them knew was that the room wasn't as private as they thought. Queens detectives had been watching La Stella for weeks. FBI, Treasury, U.S. Marshals. Everybody had a piece of somebody at that table. When the word came that the meeting had started, the cops moved in. No warning, no polite knock. 1 minute there was wine and veal, the next minute the basement was full of detectives and flashbulbs. It was Appalachian all over again, just smaller and closer to Manhattan. They arrested all 13 on a simple charge, consorting with known criminals, meaning each other, and hauled them to the Maspeth station house. Not a single gun turned up. Just expensive suits, heavy jewelry, and pockets full of cash. Nobody had less than $600 on him. Most had thick rolls of 50s and 100s. Queens DA Nat Hentel called it bigger than Appalachian. National in scope. He convened a special grand jury, promised to dig into everything. The succession in the Lucchese family, The recent murder of a crooked 300-pound lawyer named Joseph Canistracci out by the Long Island Expressway. The old rube-out of little Augie Pisano and Janice Drake. Even the way Caribbean gambling had been carved up since Castro slammed the Havana casinos shut. The mobsters posted a combined $1.3 million in bail through friendly bondsmen and went home, but the damage was done. The names were in every paper. The photographs from the jail and the courthouse were pasted into FBI files. Hentel and his rackets chief Steve Bergio started talking about giving immunity to some of them, daring them to refuse to talk so they could be hit with contempt. 4 of the 13, Mike Miranda, Tommy Eboli, Tony the Sheik, and Dominic Alonghi, beat the first round by running into federal court on civil rights grounds and getting an injunction that froze the state hearings. Others tried to save themselves by purging their contempt and talking a little in front of the grand jury. Inside the life, what mattered wasn't the legal technicalities. What mattered was that a handful of bosses had been photographed sitting together at the exact moment they were supposed to be invisible. The whole point of moving to smaller regional site-downs after Appalachian had been to avoid exactly this headline. Now the old nightmare, the spotlight, the cameras, the charts on the wall, was back. For Lucchese, the La Stella fiasco happened while he was already half out of the picture. He was in and out of hospitals, in and out of bed, rarely seen at the social clubs that used to be his second home. The brain tumor didn't care about commission politics. It worked on its own schedule. On July 13, 1967, years after Luciano's heart gave out in Naples, Tommy's own body finally called it quits. He died at 67 in his Lido beach house, not in a cell, not in a cheap motel, not in the front seat of a car with the motor running. For a man who'd lived his life in a business where most retirements came by bullet, that alone was a kind of miracle. He hadn't seen the inside of a prison in 44 years. The funeral at Our Lady of the Miraculous Medal in Point Lookout looked less like a send-off for a hood and more like a civic parade. Politicians, judges, cops who owed him favors and cops who didn't, but came anyway. Union leaders, drug dealers, pimps, bookmakers, and hitmen, all jammed together outside the church, pretending not to see the undercover detectives snapping their pictures from across the street. Gambino stood there too, the last of the old Palermo crew, watching the casket go by. This was the end of a chapter he'd never expected to outlive. Siegel, Moretti, Anastasia, Luciano, now Lucchese. The government was calling it business as usual for the national crime cartel. $40 billion a year, 750,000 men still on the payroll. But for Carlo Gambino, looking at the grave at Calvary Cemetery in Queens, it wasn't business as usual anymore. The legends were gone. The headaches, the tumors, the heart attacks had done what prosecutors and grand juries hadn't. The men who were left, Eboli, Catena, Thierry, Tramunti, Colombo, Marcello, Trafficante, were his contemporaries, not his elders. He wasn't the quiet climber anymore. He was the one everybody turned to. Back in that living room at Lido Beach, Tommy Lucchese had told him the truth. The game had changed, and now it was Gambino's game to lose.